Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often, it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, a gruesome discovery in a shallow grave.
Clearly it wasn't any accidental death. I mean, she was the victim of a murder.
But before police could catch the killer, they'd need to identify the victim.
Normally with most crimes, you want to investigate what has happened. Well, we couldn't even begin to investigate what had happened in this case, really, because first of all, we needed to know who this person was.
Could a unique form of forensic science unlock the mystery?
You put a skull in the front of the newspaper and say, does anybody recognize this person? And you'll get diddly. Put a reconstruction there and somebody will react to it.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer.
This is Norbury Road, Fairwater Police Station, which at the time was the divisional headquarters. I think the first thing I thought of was this could become my second home for the next few months, because I quickly got an idea of just how big the investigation was with the number of officers and staff that had been mobilised and the number of police vehicles that were around. It just felt absolutely huge, and you know, the biggest investigation I'd worked on up until that time.
In December 1989, DS Jeff Norman was part of a 100-strong team of detectives from South Wales Police, drafted in to solve a brutal murder.
You felt that bit more pressure, and you knew the whole team was going to be in the spotlight, so it was going to attract an awful lot of public interest, so you were just determined to try and make sure that you got the best possible result.
It's an investigation that would turn out to be far from routine. In the shadow of the Principality Stadium and next to the River Taff is Fitzhamon Embankment, once one of the city's most desirable addresses. By the late 1980s, many of its large Victorian terraced houses had been converted into flats and bedsits. It was a disturbing discovery in the rear garden of one home that would launch one of Wales's biggest murder inquiries. Journalist Martin Shipton covered the discovery of the bones for the city's main newspaper.
There were some workmen who were in a garden, and they were digging up the ground and buried not very far below the surface. In fact, I believe it was 22 inches. They came across the body, or rather the skeleton, of somebody who clearly was unidentified. So this was a major story at the time, and obviously that was a pretty horrendous thing for anyone to find.
It wasn't unusual in those days for us to get calls about bones being discovered in gardens when people are digging them up, and more often than not, they turned out to be animal bones. But this one looked a little bit different. With the flax, it just didn't look right.
It was an extreme challenge for the police to identify the victim of this murder, because while there were a few items of clothing, clearly one couldn't identify who it was from the face, because the face was no longer in existence. It was a skull. There was a skeleton. The details were extremely sketchy.
But of course, there was a drive and determination that not only did we need to identify this person, we also needed to find out how she'd come to that awful end. There was a real determination to find out exactly what had happened. So we immediately called in the Forensic Science Service and the pathologist.
With only bones, fragments of clothing, and the carpet the body was wrapped in as evidence, could forensics tell detectives who this unknown person was and how long they'd been buried for?
The Home Office pathologist was the first one to start putting us on the road with the information that we needed to identify what it was we were dealing with.
What usually happens is that the pathologist will go along to the scene and have a look at what is there and see whether there are any injuries or anything like that present that he or she can identify, but also to look at what type of skeleton it is, to see how tall the skeleton is, how tall the person was, what sex the person is, the gender, to a great extent, the ethnicity. They will have a lot of important information that they can get from the skeleton by looking at the size of the bones.
The forensic pathologist's report helped determine the bones belonged to a girl aged between 14 and 17. But the skeleton wasn't the only thing that could reveal vital information about the age of the girl and when she might have been buried.
The other items of interest that were of great use to us were items of clothing that had remained. Obviously, some of the synthetic bits and pieces had not broken down, as had the rest of the material. We had buttons, we had a zip, we had clothing labels, all of which would give us some information that we could use, importantly, to try and start building up a timeline. We could identify from that, we hoped, when they were manufactured, and we could start homing in on a date or dates between that body might have been buried in the ground.
Inquiries into her clothing revealed that the items hadn't been produced for at least 5 years. Officers now knew the sex and approximate age of the victim and potentially how long she'd been buried. And the pathologist also confirmed to detectives that she'd been forcibly restrained.
What was also of great interest to us, as if it wasn't suspicious enough at that stage, was the fact that he was able to reveal that her arms had been tied behind her back.
The forensic pathology report provided vital clues to assist the investigation. But detectives working the case now needed to establish who this unfortunate child was and why she'd been killed. December 1989, and murder detectives in Cardiff were on the hunt for a killer. A skeleton had been found wrapped in carpet and buried in a shallow grave close to the centre of the Welsh capital. But before they could find the offender, they desperately needed to identify the victim. From the forensic pathologist's report, investigators now knew she was a teenage girl aged between 14 and 17. But they still had no idea who this young girl, nicknamed Little Miss Nobody, was.
People working on the team had children, and the overriding memory is that people were talking, how come this person hasn't been missed? Why hasn't she been reported missing? There were no missing persons records that we could find that could potentially link what we'd found in that rear garden to a missing person.
It wasn't just detectives who were questioning how this could happen.
When the body was found, there was a lot of shock in Cardiff because the location is one which will be known to very many people. It's very close to the city centre. It's just across the river from the big rugby stadium in the centre of the city, and people will know that area and will not think that anything of this kind could possibly happen there. And I think there was a great deal of shock when it was discovered that the victim was as young as she was.
So there was a steely determination to do what was right for her. Clearly, at some stage, there were people that should have been looking out for her, but hadn't. So, that was our job.
Determining how long the girl had been buried would help give detectives a time frame in which to search. Once again, could science provide the evidence of when she died?
One of the most important forensic breakthroughs we had was identifying an entomologist who was able to look at what was found within the bundle of carpet and also at the scene. What the entomologist was able to tell us and explain to us was that the way in which a body decomposes when it's in the ground, and that happens largely through the way that insects attack them, and the different insects that do different things.
The insect life was very helpful in explaining how long she had been in a situation where there weren't any insects around, and then placed somewhere where they were able to get to her. And I believe the entomologist also, or the insect man, shall we say, also was able to show that from the type of insects that were around, that she'd been dead for at least 5 years, and where insects had access to her.
And he was also able to tell us that it would have been lain above ground after death and prior to burial, which again to us was of great importance, and it just heightens the suspicions that we had that this was somebody who had met a violent death.
It meant police could now start to focus their inquiries on a specific time period, starting with the residents of the flats on Fitzhamon Embankment.
It was pretty obvious to us, given that the grave was some 6 feet from the rear basement flat door of the property. It was likely that the person living in that property at the time must have known something about what had gone on. So we knew who was living in the basement flat around the time that we were being pointed in by the scientists.
Detectives' next line of inquiry centred on the carpet that the girl's body had been wrapped in.
A resident of the basement flat was able to tell us that she recognised that carpet, as it had been one that she'd selected when the landlord asked her to, when it needed recarpeting. And she thought that it might have been an offcut that had remained after the carpet had been fitted and kept in a cupboard under the stairs. So a lot of our research was done on those residents, and the residents of the basement flat were of particular importance to us. And it was through some of those inquiries that we discovered not only the person that had lived there when the carpet had been laid, but also when Alan Charlton had lived there.
But just who was Alan Charlton?
So it's here in the centre of Cardiff, in one of the what is now pedestrian streets, Caroline Street, where Alan Charlton used to work as a bouncer at the XL Club, which was here. He was somebody who was quite muscular and obviously appealed to the employers, the people who ran the club, because they thought that he looked the sort of person who would be able to deal with any kind of trouble.
And trouble would often find its way to this area of the capital. in part due to its location close to the city's main transport hub and a notorious hangout for ne'er-do-wells.
Not far away was the bus station where there was a cafe known as Asti's Cafe where one would see young girls standing outside, hovering around, and they were often runaways of one kind or another, people who were lost, and actually they were pretty vulnerable people, but they formed part of an underclass in Cardiff, almost a parallel society that Alan Charlton was also part of. And I suppose in a sense he straddled two elements because he was employed as a bouncer, so he was in gainful employment, but he also had an extremely unhealthy interest in young girls, which led him into associating with these very unfortunate, vulnerable people.
He was very much a ladies' man. He was known to throw lots of parties, including at the basement flat, and that women attended that flat, but also some younger girls too.
Investigators now had a person of interest. Meanwhile, another forensic discipline was helping detectives piece together how the young girl had died.
As part of the identification process, we also used the services of an odontologist. He was able to look at the teeth, confirming the age range the pathologist had come up with. Another key finding of Dr. Whitaker's work was the blood that he found within the teeth themselves.
But I believe that Professor Whitaker found what we call pink teeth, which is one of the signs that's said to be associated with strangulation. That may well be the case, but we have to remember that pink teeth can occur in all sorts of situations when somebody is in the process of dying, particularly if there is a loss of oxygen to the body.
So it was clear to us that this person had met a violent death, which fitted in with what we'd found from some of the other forensic sciences.
Charlton's residence, just feet from where the body was found, had already put him on the investigators' radar. Now the forensic confirmation of the young girl's violent death, tied in with the nightclub bouncer's previous run-ins with the law, raised suspicion further.
Alan Charlton was of significant interest to us from that early stage because he was well known to other police forces. He appeared to be a violent offender and had been the suspect in rape investigations, in assault investigations where there was evidence that women had been attacked.
But those suspicions had not led to charges, and Charlton denied any knowledge of the body found just feet away from where he used to live. Still without a name for the dead girl, the investigation needed a breakthrough. That would come courtesy of a relic dating back to 800 years BC.
It all started with an Egyptian mummy, and that really was the start of my involvement with the forensic fraternity.
Murder Squad detectives in Cardiff were frantically trying to identify the body of Little Miss Nobody, a teenage girl whose skeletal remains had been found buried in the garden of a flat close to the city centre in December 1989. They also had a prime suspect, nightclub bouncer Alan Charlton, but without knowing who the dead girl was and her possible connection to their suspect, police couldn't progress the case against him. Detectives now gambled on a new forensic technique to unravel the mystery of their victim.
Crucial to the identification of this person was to try and put a face to that person. And we decided that a course of action that would assist us in doing just that might be to try and recreate from the skull that we'd found what that person might have looked like. Now, in those days, I had no idea that something like that could be done.
The man leading this pioneering process was Professor Richard Neve.
I was employed by the University of Manchester, and I was working in the medical school as an artist, which involved at that time making drawings and paintings of various anatomical and surgical procedures. Also, it involved making exhibitions and displays. The university had embarked upon a sort of interdepartmental project to unwrap and study an ancient Egyptian mummy in the university's museum. And this had a number of spin-offs, and one of them was for me to take the remains of the skull and to build a face.
As part of the Manchester Mummy Project, Professor Neve was tasked with rebuilding the shattered skull of mummy 1770 to create a model of how the Egyptian princess might have looked.
I actually reconstructed the face of this little mummy girl, and the resulting publicity kind of went a long way. And that really was the start of my involvement with the forensic fraternity, purely and simply because of the publicity that the mummy had generated. And it became one of the few options that a police force would have in trying to identify an otherwise unidentifiable body.
Detectives from South Wales, including Jeff Norman, were soon heading to Manchester to utilise Professor Neve's unique skills.
I took the skull to Manchester, and I remember taking it in a cardboard box. It seemed very, very weird at the time, but clearly it was really important because this was something that could potentially lead to the identification of this person. He was confident that he would be able to come up with an image for us that might be able to jog somebody's memory.
After making a cast of the skull, Professor Neve began to painstakingly rebuild Little Miss Nobody's face.
I used modelling clay and developed basically the underlying muscle structures of the face. So the muscles that form around the eye and the mouth and the muscles of the cheeks, and building up all these muscles, controlled to some extent by the measurements which have been placed into the skull. The face will grow from the surface of the skull out. It is not an artistic exercise at all.
After around 5 days of meticulous modelling, Professor Neve had finally given Little Miss Nobody a face.
What we're looking at here is a photograph of the reconstruction. You can see she's got a fairly straight sort of forehead. As with most females, the brow ridges are relatively light. And then she's got a fairly light sort of chin, very female sort of chin. It's a typical teenage face.
The forensic facial reconstruction produced by Professor Neve was initially met with scepticism by investigators.
I have to say it was very strange when we saw the image that he produced, because the first thing I was thinking of, and I know after discussing it with colleagues, we thought the same thing, does that look like a real person? Is that something that people are going to look at and say, I know who that is?
There were limitations, but you put a skull in the front of the newspaper and say, does anybody recognise this person? And you'll get diddly, no matter how big the story. Put a reconstruction there and somebody will react to it.
And when the image was released to the media, detectives did get a reaction.
We went to press both locally and also went to Crime Watch to make an appeal. We had a lot of calls, but there were 2 calls of particular interest to us. One from a person who worked in a social services care home in Pontypridd to the north of Cardiff, and they gave the same name as another person had phoned in with.
40 days into their murder investigation, police were finally able to give the girl known as Little Miss Nobody her real identity back.
That name was Karen Price.
Karen Price was quite a troubled young girl. At the time of what occurred, she was 15. She obviously had a troubled childhood because she was living in an assessment centre at a place called Church Village, which is near Pontypridd, which is approximately 10 or 12 miles to the north of Cardiff.
And this is the children's home, or the entrance to the children's home. The walls. This is the home that I spent 2.5 years in. And obviously, this is the home that Karen lived. Or it was.
Lee Hatch was a resident here along with Karen Price in 1981.
11 years of age, you're thinking, what? Where am I going? You know, my school isn't like this. My house isn't like this. This is new, it's different. There's good memories, but seeing the building itself brought back the bad memories as well. First thing I thought about was the bedroom there. Not the veranda that I jumped off. Not a gang of us in the doorway smoking. Karen would have been in this section here. This was then the television area. The other side of that was the games room. The dining area would have been them 2 windows. She always had something in her hair, always. She was sort of Bananarama-esque way before they even thought about it. It was either a hat pulled down over her eyes or some sort of bandana or a scarf. And she always liked wearing men's shirts, which I found really strange. You know, she wasn't a girly girl.
Like many other kids in care at the centre, Karen often found herself at odds with staff. The solution? To abscond.
I would say there was at least one a week. You know, it's... and it might be that it wasn't proper absconding. You know, you'd have an argument with somebody, you'd run off, everybody'd start phoning round, they worried about you, and you'd walk back in. 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 hours.
Obviously, she wasn't happy there because she was absconding from the establishment, as did some of her contemporaries as well. And what would tend to happen would be that when they did that, they would come down to Cardiff.
The first time I saw Karen abscond and get into the car was this end of the building. And we heard a commotion coming from the house. Then all of a sudden we seen her run down and she came round the corner. The car was sort of parked at that angle and she just ran down and jumped straight into the back of it. And he drove off and down around.
Could that mystery man in the car have been Alan Charlton?
You could see he was a grown man, but you couldn't see his face. You could only see him at an acute angle. And then, by the time I come round, she was in the back of the car and the car had gone round the corner.
According to Lee, he saw Karen get into waiting cars on several occasions, but she'd always returned.
If you went missing, most of the time, the friends knew where you'd gone. You know? There was no mobile phone, but word of mouth. Eventually, somebody would crack and they'd say to the staff, oh, he's gone here. You know, and then it's like, oh, well, back you come.
For Karen, it seemed nobody did crack when she failed to reappear.
The boys were capable of living their lives. The girls looked scared. Karen included. I suppose it's trouble solved, really, because I don't think she had anybody that, same as we all did, I don't think she had anybody that she could actually talk to and tell what was going on.
Nobody would report her disappearance or that she hadn't returned to the home or to school. In life as in death, Karen Price was a little Miss Nobody. But just who had been responsible for her murder? Back in late 80s Cardiff, a team of murder squad detectives had been trying to identify the remains of a young girl found buried in a shallow grave. A forensic facial reconstruction using the girl's skull had allowed investigators to give Little Miss Nobody a face. And a UK-wide press and TV campaign resulted in officers putting a name to the face, Karen Price. Now, another new forensic technique pioneered by pathologist Peter Venezes helped confirm the skull definitely was Karen's.
Well, what stands out about this particular case for me was that it was actually probably the first case that I did where we were involved in a murder inquiry with facial superimposition. Certainly one of the first in this country, as far as I'm aware.
Using a photograph police now had of Karen, Dr. Venezes was able to compare that to her skull found in the shallow grave.
Basically, what we did was we took an image of the skull, which was then recorded. That was used as our first image. We could then, because we had the skull there, we could turn it round into different positions, so we could match it up with the angle at which the photograph we had. So we took into account the perspective, and by doing that at the different angles, we could then see whether different parts of the anatomy of the skull matched up with different parts of the anatomy of the photograph. And also, because she was smiling, we were able to see the outline of the teeth, both in the photograph and in the skull itself. So that was very useful. And actually, not just in her case, but it was a very useful technique that we used in a number of other murder cases that we did over that time.
And the now tried and tested forensic technique of DNA sampling, still in its early days back then, would provide the ultimate proof the bones belonged to Karen.
They really had to do this because the facial reconstruction and superimposition was all very well, but you needed something which was completely definitive. This is when they went to Sir Alec Jeffreys, and he advised them to go to the families and get samples.
In the early 1980s, geneticist Sir Alec Jeffreys had developed the revolutionary technique of genetic fingerprinting and DNA profiling. 2 years before Karen's remains were discovered, Jeffreys' technique had led to the world's first murder conviction using DNA. Colin Pitchfork, whose semen had been found at the scene of the rapes and murders of both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, received a 28-year prison sentence. Now, similar science, taking DNA from Karen's estranged parents, could prove a familial link to the bones found in the garden.
They then were able to get the samples, and that's when they were able to match these with the samples that were taken from the bones at that time, and it was successful. I believe Sir Alec Jeffreys in court said that, that there was a 99.9% chance that it was Karen Price.
Forensics had identified the victim. Now detectives in Cardiff needed hard evidence against the man they suspected of Karen Price's murder. And they were about to receive a call that would break the case wide open.
I was watching TV with my friend Idris, his partner and my partner. Crime Watch came on and they were talking about a young girl, Karen Price, who had gone missing in Cardiff and her body was found. Idris had said that he knew her and he knew her boyfriend and somebody she was hanging around with.
Idris Ali had been 16 at the time of Karen's murder. 8 years on, he had a girlfriend and a son and was sharing a house with Make Corcoran in Cardiff.
Nick Ross concluded the programme by saying, if you were a friend of her then, be a friend of hers now. And I repeated those words to Idris. If you were a friend of her then, be a friend of her now. The police are looking for any information. If you know the boyfriend, that might give them a clue as to what might be going on.
Officers were dispatched immediately to speak to Idris Ali, and then he was interviewed over a number of days. And he eventually told us that he had actually supplied young girls to Alan Charlton to attend at some of the parties that he used to have at his basement flat. At one of these parties, 2 girls had been invited. He'd actually supplied them.
One of those girls was Karen, and the other, only 13 at the time, would provide detectives with the vital evidence they needed against Alan Charlton.
She was able to tell us that there was a party, that she was there with Karen. Alan Charlton had asked both girls to undress so that he could take photographs of them on the bed. Karen refused, and as a result of her refusal, Alan Charlton struck her. She told us that as a result of that first blow by Alan Charlton, Karen Price was nearly certainly unconscious, possibly even dead already. But Alan Charlton tied her hands behind her back, put her on the bed, and continued to assault her, despite the efforts of both her and Idris Ali in preventing him from doing so.
The key witness would also confirm the forensic analysis about what happened to Karen in the days after she'd been murdered.
Idris Ali was able to tell us that the body wasn't buried immediately, that it had been kept in the basement flat for several days, whilst Alan Charlton was deciding what to do with it. But he was then made by Charlton to return to the flat to assist him in disposing of the body in the grave in the rear garden.
After almost a decade, the tragic story of a girl society had chosen to forget was finally being told, thanks in no small part to forensic science.
I think it's fair to say that this was a hugely significant investigation for anybody who worked on it. The teamwork was outstanding, not just from within the police officers themselves and the other members of staff that were involved, but also the forensic science teams that were involved and so worked closely together with the investigation team itself.
Looking back on it, I suppose one feels, or I feel a sense of doing a job properly and getting the right results, and knowing I've got the right results, that is always a good thing to do.
In 1991, Charlton would appear in court charged with Karen's murder 8 years earlier.
Yeah, I made a point the whole time I was there, keeping an eye on Charlton, just totally impassive, almost as if he wasn't even listening. I don't know. Just, you know, sometimes you get people in the dock who are writing copious notes, who are constantly wanting to talk to their legal team. He just sat there the whole time, never said anything to anybody. Very strange individual.
What we know about Alan Charlton and the perception that other people had of him is very largely determined by what happened in this case. So we know, for example, that Idris Ali, who was his co-accused, was terrified of him, and that he wouldn't want to cross him, and that he was in fact induced to participate in the killing by him because of his fear of him. So he must have had a very powerful, controlling personality. That's absolutely clear.
A jury would find Charlton guilty of Karen's murder and sentence him to life, with a minimum of 15 years in prison.
Now, this was in 1991, and the 15 years clearly was up in 2006, but to this day, he remains in prison. Very often it's the case that if defendants refuse to accept their guilt, they will not be released.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man. I hope he never gets out.
Ali was also convicted of murder, but his conviction changed to manslaughter at a retrial in 1994.
I think it was a real achievement to successfully not only convict the people responsible for her death, but to even identify her in the first place, given what we started with, which was literally a bag of bones.
The police investigation might have delivered justice for Karen, but the question remained: how had a vulnerable young girl been allowed to simply vanish without the alarm being raised?
One of the huge sadnesses about this case is that one could say that people were more caring about Karen after her death than they had been during her life. If she had been cared for in the way that she deserved, as everybody deserves, as every vulnerable person deserves, then she wouldn't have ended up in the appalling situation that led to her losing her life.
I mean, me personally, I find that too difficult to comprehend. Really too difficult to comprehend, because everybody I knew at that time, every child I knew growing up, always had somebody to watch their back, always. And I just feel really sad that Karen didn't. It's horrible, really horrible, to know that you can die and not be bothered about.